With their blank scrolls and idol worship, the Jews depicted in the Exodus scene provide a clear warning of alleged Jewish wrongdoing, and in one way, as argued by Deborah Strickland, can be seen as a justification of the mass expulsion of England's Jews only a decade before. In a similar vein, the portrayal of the marvellous peoples, mostly constrained to the edge of the world, yet interestingly enough, still encompassed within it, demonstrates a similar differentiation of peoples, often based on cultural, not physical differences. In our last video, we explored the significance of religion and the marvellous peoples in our study of race and the Hereford World Map. This time, we'll be questioning the role climate theory and skin colour played in the medieval world. Dated to around 1300, the Hereford Map was constructed in a period of mass translation of Greek and Arabic scholarship into Latin, new types of debates in universities, and thoughts on the interaction of climate and racial fluidity. Also, though still heavily debated, this was a period of shifting views towards skin colour played out on stained glass windows and world maps. So was it unusual that the Hereford World Map didn't paint in its peoples? If skin colour had moral connotations, why aren't the depictions of the damned and the saved in the Last Judgment different colours? This video will engage with these questions and go further by asking historians their opinions on the use of the term race, the decolonisation of the university curriculum, and how medievalists should interact with modern racial debates. Once again, I will use the help of leading academics in the field to further explore these different aspects of race in the Hereford Mappa Mundi.
So I think, first of all, it's important to stress that climate theory actually didn't really disappear from view in the early Middle Ages either. So you actually see the influence of climate theory running through patristic biblical commentary from the 3rd century onwards. But it does gain more influence in the 12th and 13th century with the rise of schools of universities in Western Europe. And very briefly, climate theory, which is an ancient Greek theory that was first articulated, at least this is the first sort of surviving text that we have, by Hippocrates, airs, waters, places. And then you'll find the influence of climate theory throughout Greco science, in Roman science, and for instance in Ciceronian thought, and then throughout the early medieval period. It argues that environment, climate, places impact the bodies and minds of individuals and groups, and because it is focused on place, it is sort of easily applicable to ethnic groups as well. Not just only ethnic groups, but because of the focus on place, it's sort of a logical step to be made. And the basic idea is that the middle is the most temperate and the most ideal, and north and south and east and west are where, you know, so when you move away from the middle, bodies and minds are susceptible to, for instance, a lesser degree of rationality or weakness of body in the south. In the north, away from the middle, a stronger degree of sort of hot-blooded rashness, brutality. And this idea of middle is sort of interpreted ethnocentrically. So for the Greek, it was Greece, and for the Italians, for the Romans, it was Rome, Latium. You'll see in Arabic thought that North Africa is presented as the ideal middle. And then from the 12th century onwards, you'll see in texts that Western Europe is presented as an ideal temperate middle. So it's very relativistic in that sense.
Medieval race theory, such as that's a phrase that would make any sense to utter, was not consistent or unified or sort of global in scope. It varied quite a bit, and some authors found ways of merging various systems. So there were, older ideas about lines of descent, and then newer ideas that kind of tried to associate various kinds of climate with various bodily effects. But and there's a kind of science that, it seems like science, right? Hotter weather, leads to people having darker skin and curly hair and so on. But what we find is that, I think it's just important to be clear about this, those climate theories shift directly into racial theories and quite overtly racist theories as well. So the theory is that, only the people who come from conveniently the location where these texts are being written, which is, more Western and more Northern Europe, are the only ones who have the proper balance of traits, because the coolness of the weather makes them stronger and wiser and more just and all the rest, whereas people from hot climates are inherently problematic in a whole variety of ways according to these theories. Now there are maps that explicitly engage with climate zones, called zonal maps. You've probably seen these, and they look sort of startlingly modern, actually, compared to a lot of other medieval mapping forms, because you get two frigid zones, you get a globe, right? You can never say too many times, medieval geographers, cartographers, philosophers knew the world was a sphere. They wrote about it spherically many times. My favorite line about this comes from the Venerable Bede, who's writing in early medieval Northern England, who says that the earth is round like a playground ball. So anyway, spherical earth, with two polar regions, which are the frigid zones, two temperate regions. Conveniently, one of those is where Europe is located, and then the torrid zone through the middle of that, which is the equator, and their theory was that the ecumene, the inhabitable portion of the world, was all located in the northern hemisphere, and they theorized things about the southern hemisphere. Maybe there was a whole nother, sort of Europe-like place down there in the other temperate zone, but they thought you could never get there because the torrid zone is too hot. No one could survive it, even though they also wrote about Bedouins, who they knew were people who crossed the vast uncrossable desert there routinely. And so I don't know why they didn't just ask the Bedouins. So we do have maps that engage with climate theory. We have some maps that seem to kind of merge climate theory and other theories. Hereford, I don't actually see a lot of evidence of the climate theory on there. It seems structurally it's a TO map, which is the most common map type of the Middle Ages. Fascinating documents, absolutely extraordinary things.
Structurally, climate theory is better suited to the zonal divisions found in Macrobian maps rather than the TO structure found on the Hereford map. However, the prevalence of towns in Europe compared to the map's depiction of the wider world potentially highlights the map's interactions with climate theories in a different way.
The other thing that did really strike me on the Hereford map is the fact that Europe, the level of urbanization, the way that urbanization is depicted in Europe sort of very significantly is sort of very ordered, and whereas the other regions have much more, so they have, the other regions show the Plinian races, but also much more animals and it's much more disordered. I think is also very significant, because the levels of urbanization are very much considered to be products of good government, good order of society, lawfulness, use of reason in a sort of evolutionary narrative. And the idea so these well-ordered societies in Europe have been able to reach the level of urbanization, have moved from nomadic to agricultural systems to urbanization, and other regions haven't. So I think that's very, you can really see that on the map. And what is perhaps worthwhile, I don't know if you've already done that, but so there are also textual descriptions of TO maps. For instance, Benoit of Saint-Marc in his Chronicles in the 12th century, he also gives a sort of textual TO map. And he says very explicitly that the people in Europe are handsomely shaped, they have wise manners, they are discreet, reasonable, well-dressed. They're neither too short nor too short, so their physical, their tallness is exactly perfect. They have laws, they have justice, and they believe in the Christian God. And then in the other parts of the world is lawlessness, lack of religion or reason, and there people are compared to dogs. They're chinless, they're horned and hairy. So there you see this sort of monstrosity really creeping into it as well. So you could perhaps look and see and argue that the Hereford map is also doing sort of more or less the same visually as these textual sources are also expressing.
The attribution of specific physical and moral characteristics on certain places depended on many factors, including humoral makeup, relief, and diet. Therefore, the next logical question to ask is, could this change?
If you look at the scientific texts or scientific discourse, so learned, scientific is also problematic, but learned discourse of natural philosophers thinking about the human body and its behavior, and what governs it. When you look at in these sources, so produced by physicians or philosophers from the late 13th century onwards, you can see a dominant view that suggests that the essential category that determines who a person is biologically, not metaphysically, but biologically. So I'm not talking about the rational soul, but the complexion of the body, kind of a concept, kind of a mega concept that around which the all explanations of physical, intellectual, emotional behaviors of people was organized. These people, those learned people, saw it as a kind of a possibility that though each person has his individual complexion, which determines his individuality, this complexion, which has various dimensions, and they use the terms natural complexion and also their radical complexion, so kind of even more minute, more specific, more unchangeable element in this kind of if you want to say in modern concepts, again, entirely anachronistic, the DNA of the person. This element, which really determines who he is or she is when moving from one climatic zone to another, can change. It's a very slow change. They don't conceptualize, exactly how it works, but they envisage that this can change. So when a person moves, kind of a black person moves to a kind of another climatic zone where there are white people, and he stays there and lives there for a long time, slowly his complexion will change. It will not undergo a total transformation in one's lifetime, but it is changeable. And this is why I suggested that, again, if you look at only at the scientific sources, the ones that I am looking as a historian, whether they are medical sources or physiognomy, which I'm working on now, I find almost no clear allusion to racial thinking amongst these people. Doesn't mean that they don't think biologically about the way we are and about the differences between individuals or groups of people. They do, but it is not a very kind of rigid concept of boundaries which cannot be crossed between the individuals or the groups from which they come.
Did climatic theory increase racial fluidity in the 13th century? Or did it create fixed boundaries from which identity and geography went hand in hand? Or was it a mixture of both? The position of skin colour in the medieval period is still a hotly debated topic. So how does the Hereford map interact with these debates? Is it odd that the map did not paint in the skin colour of its peoples?
There's a view that medieval people were not particularly, if the term can be used, race aware in the sense of focusing on skin colour. There's a traditional argument that medieval Western Europeans didn't particularly focus on skin colour, and that when they wanted to talk about difference, they concentrated on other things. They were interested in cultural demarcators like clothing and hairstyle and weapons and customs. I think this view is giving way to more of a perception that actually medieval people were interested in difference of skin colour. Whether the Hereford monsters were painted in a way to indicate that is a moot point. It's a question that we would need an expert on the Hereford map and an expert on, I think specifically the pigments on the Hereford map to answer. But the possibility that the map maker was interested in the skin colour of different peoples, including the monstrous races, I think is definitely a possibility that we ought to hold open. More recent art historians have suggested that, for example, the idea of whiteness becomes a preoccupation among some illustrators in the 13th century in a way that it doesn't seem to have been before. I think it's perhaps a rather nice illustration of how, as our interests and our concerns and our anxieties as modern 21st century people change, we continue to see new things in the medieval evidence and to read the medieval evidence in different ways.
The shifting interests of the modern day allow us to approach sources from new and exciting angles. Indeed, recent campaigns have stimulated further reflection on how the study of history should be taught and what terms are best used to describe the past. So where does this leave medieval historians? And what role could and should a medievalist play in modern racial debates?
Medievalists are people as well as medievalists, like those dogheads, humans. And of course, medievalists have views and opinions as citizens, and they should have views. And obviously the question of something as fundamental as equality of treatment of people regardless of their skin color seems to me a very essential one, which you might want to have an opinion on as a person, whether you were a medievalist or any other kind of citizen, right? So that's my view on that.
What contribution should medievalists make in decolonising the university curriculum? I think that medievalists should make just as much effort to contribute to this process as somebody who does modern history. But I think the way that medievalists do it can be different because of our evidence base and because of the theory and practice behind what we do. So I think, the word decolonisation itself has come under lots of criticism lately, but my definition of what does decolonising mean essentially is, can we make more effort to teach the history of medieval Europe by not just talking about medieval white male people, basically? And the answer is yes, we can. And there are lots of examples of medieval people engaging with other cultures and other cultures coming into medieval Europe and having really positive impact on literature and art and those kinds of things. And I think if I teach a first year medieval course that has elements of that in it, I am engaging with a broader body of students than I would if I was just teaching them about the history of Britain and British, whatever you think of as British people in that period. And I also think for students who might identify as white British students, because we have many of those on our courses, we're helping those students to see that engagement between cultures and peoples, or whatever labels you want to use, is something that's been happening for hundreds and thousands of years. And it isn't just a new thing that's been happening and it only applies to you if you take a course in modern history. Actually, there's evidence for it going back to our period and beyond. I think we also need, I think as a medievalist who mainly teaches about European history in the Central Middle Ages, I also think that it's my duty to teach students about, frankly, what happened and what people did in the Middle Ages. And if that's unsavory and if it's uncomfortable, I think we still have to teach it. We teach it in a sympathetic manner that isn't celebratory and it isn't blunt and it's nuanced. But I also do think that it's our job to show students that relations between different groups of peoples in the European Middle Ages were not always good. There are some excellent examples of good relations and great cultural things that come out of it, but there are also some examples of really nasty practices.
But one of the things that strikes me about people in the Middle Ages talking about, we'll call it differentiation of peoples, is that they always do stress, or they always have something definitional about it being a descent group. They always have something. The word gens itself, it means that it's related to genealogy and so on. So they always include an element of descent, common descent, being important, but they never leave it at that. They never simply say that. They always add other distinguishing features. Characteristically, these would be language, clothing, and customs of various kinds. Those would be a very standard little recipe for when people in the Middle Ages talk about different peoples. And not one of those, language, clothing, customs, not one of them is fixed and impermanent. They can all be changed, and not one of them is an obvious proxy for descent. You know, you can have people of very different descents, heritages, speaking the same language, and so on and so forth, or people of very common descent speaking different languages, so that they're not synonyms for descent. So that seems to be where that's my impression I get of the language they use. And of course, the language offers various terms. You know, the common Latin, most common Latin term is gens. That's the one that crops up again and again. Race itself is not a medieval word, or at least it's only comes in at the very end of the Middle Ages. It's not a medieval term in either in a Latin equivalent or in any of the vernaculars, but it comes in right at the end of the Middle Ages, and then primarily it's to do with animal breeding, horse breeding, for example. You know, they talk about different races of horses, so it means a breed, and that's what it means, and it's not really significantly different in its range when it's applied to human beings from gens, because that's what gens means, a group of common descent and a breed. You know, people don't nowadays use the word breed for human beings, but I mean, that's what it is, isn't it, we're talking about. So especially when people make the claim, which is very common, of course, that there is no concept of race in the Middle Ages, I don't really know what they're talking about, because I think, sure, the word wasn't there, but I think a view that human beings are divided up into populations of common descent, if that's not race, I don't know what is. And then, of course, kind of the next step would be whether there's racism. And I suppose, you know, racism logically presupposes that you believe there are races, that is, descent groups in humanity. But the next step, of course, and this is a crucial one, is that you believe some of those descent groups are superior to others. That's the crucial step. And if you define it that way, humanity is divided into different population groups who are descent groups of common descent, and some are superior to others. You can find that all over the Middle Ages, all over. It's just everywhere. So I don't really see that the argument that race or racism is not present everywhere in the Middle Ages.
One of the great things about history is that it frees us from the tyranny of the inevitable, the idea that things had to work out in the way that they did. Well, you know, look at Europe in the 12th and 13th century, and there's nothing there that predicts modern colonialism. Or perhaps there are things, you know, perhaps we can look at the Hereford Map and we can say there are mentalities there that we know are going to be the starting point for long and troubling histories in the way that Europeans engage with the other. But there are also all kinds of other lines of development that could have gone in quite different ways. And there are other societies that might have developed in different ways. So exploring the medieval world in all its otherness, as well as its elements of familiarity, and exploring other medieval worlds, less familiar ones beyond the European, is something that, as a big department like Durham that's very committed to medieval history, we're in a position to do. I think that's going to be an incredibly exciting journey.